Well, I'm excited about all of this, obviously, but I'm really excited about this session that we've got coming up because we've got two amazing music champs joining us, and I have the privilege of introducing them both. Rebecca Gates is a musician, an artist, an activist, and a sound worker whose practice spans performance, installation, design, and curation. She's released 5 albums, including 3 as the leader of the Spinanes, which hopefully you've heard of, but they have 3 records out on Sub Pop. They've toured globally, and she's appeared as a vocalist on numerous records by artists such as Elliott Smith, The Decemberists, and Willie Nelson. Rebecca does phenomenal work with installations and sound installations, including in the public space, and she's produced programs and symposiums and co-curated the Marfa sessions, an exhibition of sonic land art installations at Ballroom Marfa in Texas. She's an affiliate faculty member at Virginia Commonwealth University's School of the Arts in Richmond, Virginia, teaching sound art, site-specific sound studies, and music commons. I first had the privilege of meeting Rebecca in the 90s when I was producing a show at the Bellevue YMCA with Fugazi, and her band, the Spinanes, was opening the show. So our work has continued to intersect here and there in different ways ever since, mostly around music ecosystem policy. So thanks for stepping up to the plate to interview Dow, Rebecca. We are delighted to have you. And I'm also thrilled to introduce you to my boss, King County Executive Dow Constantine. And I'll tell you how I met him because it speaks to who Dow is. Dow has been a state representative and then a state senator in the late 90s. And in 2002, Dow left the Washington Senate and became a King County council person. And I was an activist working with young people to get our Footloose law, which we had on our books at the time, called the Teen Dance Ordinance repealed, and launching the Vera Project in Seattle. And I was with a young activist, and we were at a King County Council meeting, testifying about repealing the Teen Dance Ordinance and starting the Vera Project. And 8 of the council members looked like they might fall asleep while we were speaking. And one of them looked like he might jump out of his chair with excitement. And that was Dow Constantine. And that was when we first met. And he has been a champion of all things art, music, and culture, but he does have a few other responsibilities. He is the executive for the 12th largest county in the country, a county that has 16,000 employees and is slightly larger than the state of Rhode Island. He oversees our public health department for the entire region here in King County, the court system, the criminal justice system, a massive park system. We partner with 39 cities in King County, and Dow has oversight of all of the unincorporated area in King County, which is much of the land mass. So he also has, in addition, as part of his giant job, he had oversight of the first public health department to have to wrangle with COVID. So there was no roadmap. And working in his office, I can tell you that I never saw red tape be cut so fast in my whole life to get things moving to protect the health of the people. Giant effort swung into play to try to protect us all as COVID came to become our reality. And yet he never took his eye off the ball with the creative economy, even while managing all of that. In fact, he immediately assigned me to be doing two-way communication around public health issues to the entire creative sector. We have a handbook we published in mid-March that I will put up in the links after he's done talking so as not to distract you. So he also led the charge to pass the first public funding post-COVID to support independent live music venues. And he got that done in May of 2020. So clearly he's a champ of the things we all care about. And here is the very best news. He's just announced that he's running again for King County Executive for another term. So we are very, very excited. And Dow, was I not supposed to say that? Your reaction. Oh, okay. So with that, please take it away, Rebecca and Dow. This is all yours, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate that kind introduction. And hi, Dow. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Rebecca.
First of all, a huge thank you to you for joining us in what I know is an especially demanding week and an especially demanding season. So appreciate your time and generosity. There are a lot of things we could talk about with your breadth of knowledge that Kate just laid out, but how about a little music talk? And I like to start off with some very...
One musician and one fanboy, basically. So you're asking me the questions and I will do my best.
Okay. It takes all kinds. All right, very important questions to start out with. What was the first record you bought with your own money?
Oh, that's an easy one because I've talked about this before. I rode my bike up to a little business district here in West Seattle in 4th grade and asked the record store clerk, one of my favorite class of people, what I should get with my allowance. And he pointed me to something on the singles charts, Lean on Me by Bill Withers, which he then put in a little paper bag and I wrapped around the handlebars and rode home and played on my parents' giant Magnavox until it was pretty much worn out, but I do still have it.
Good one. I like that answer. Do you remember the first MP3 you downloaded? Not many people do, but I like to ask.
There's no album cover to hold on to, so it's really hard to remember. No, I don't, honestly.
What was the last show you saw in person before COVID closed venues?
This relates to something Kate was talking about. It was at the Vera Project Gala, and it was a band called Huey and the Influentials, which sounds like Huey Lewis and the News, but it's very young and multicultural and hip and fun. And that was just like a week before we had our first COVID cases here. At Washington Hall, a beautifully restored venue where we used to see the punk rock bands in the old days.
I've played Washington Hall and love the Vera Project. So it's amazing that those are still continuing. Last speed round question. What was the most recent show or live stream that you've watched online?
Trying to remember, I think it was Nick Cave all by himself with a piano, which was, appropriately, dramatically Nick Cave. It was really well done, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then listened to Elvis Costello get interviewed by a BBC radio host just a couple days ago, I think.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I'm curious about just if you can quickly, I know that your path is long and your dedication to government is strong, but if you can offer a little bit of context for our conversation about how you got into government and where you started and your path to where you are now.
I grew up in Seattle and I worked on a lot of campaigns, and I was also very involved in the music scene. Again, not as a musician. I really was involved with the music community working on political issues before I ran for the House of Representatives in 1996. And one of the big things that pushed me over the top was right at the very end. Chris Novoselic got a bunch of his friends to make donations and allow me to send out one last mailing. And after a long count, not too different from this year's presidential election count, I ended up winning by a couple hundred votes. But I suddenly was receiving checks from like Eddie Vedder and Kim Thale, who worked with me at the old college radio station, and Jonathan and Bruce helped out. And it was just an amazing outpouring of support from these people who are kind of in my cohort, but had actually pursued music and done well, and were now turning around to try to help out their community.
Great. That speaks to, I was curious about, you just touched on it, but also just the historical context of the scene in Seattle and the music community, and how going into government was an evolution of your connection to them through radio and being a fan, and what was present sort of in that community and the scenes that have helped you bring your great music sector work into your practice.
It was, the Seattle scene eventually kind of bubbled to the surface and blew up, but like all music scenes, including what you experienced in Portland, it was very grassroots, right? And like good politics is grassroots. And there were a lot of people working very earnestly and interacting with each other and sharing ideas and reaching out to new people and recruiting them in. And the work that I was doing in politics really was intertwined with that scene at the time, particularly because of things like what Kate was discussing around the teen dance ordinance and challenges we were having in the state legislature. So it was a natural fit. And, one of the things that we can discuss a little bit later is how the remarkable economic success of Seattle has in many ways put squeeze on our musical grassroots and the ability to continually replenish that well of talent and creativity.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think another thing is, I think people often forget how vibrant musical scene Seattle was and has been forever with jazz and hip hop, and not only the scene that we are both came out of and a part of, but that's something that I think is everyone has close at hand, but we often forget sometimes that there's that actual long timeline.
Very true. And my parents often talk about the old jazz clubs on Jackson, and it's this continuous musical community from different ethnic and racial and even geographic perspectives, intertwining over the course of really an entire century, at least, of popular music. And I'm worried about losing it because of things like COVID and things like the run-up in real estate values just chasing people out of the region, out of the city.
Yeah, valid concerns. So Kate touched on the fact that your purview is wide, and one of the things that you administer is public health. So can you talk about how the scope of your work shifted when the pandemic hit?
Yeah, I was actually in DC when I got the call late night that we had the first outbreak in the United States, and I hopped the first flight back, for Alaska Airlines flight back, because that's what we do out here. And I immediately hit the ground, went to a press conference, and really have not stopped since. On the flight, was thinking about where we needed to focus to prevent infection. It was in nursing homes, that's where it started, but I was worried about our detention facilities, I was worried about homeless shelters, and I was already thinking about restaurants, nightclubs, venues, the places that make life in a city fun and exciting and vibrant and worthwhile, and what it was going to mean for those institutions. And I'm continuing to, and now everyone nationally and globally is worried about the health of venues and the way in which we're going to be able to preserve and reclaim that part of our personality, that part of our culture.
In part of dealing with that, Kate alluded to in May, you directed the first public funding in the country to live music venues. Can you talk about that initiative and how it came to pass, sort of from those initial thoughts on the plane?
Well, we had some initial funding from the federal government, and we don't have a lot of local authority to create new tax revenues. So a lot of times when there's a change in circumstance, we have to rely on the feds or the state to authorize us to raise money. So we had some funding, and of course, as I said, these places had been front of mind, and we had conversations with a lot of the venue owners and the music community about what we could do, not knowing how long this was going to go on, right? So I sent over a proposal to county council to allocate $2 million to help 36 or so venues, and they allocated some of the money to specific things and then approved $750,000, which did get pushed out to venues to help them get through a couple of months there. But we are continuing to look for funding sources that we can use to make sure that that infrastructure that supports so many jobs and so much of who we view ourselves as a region is able to survive what looks like is now going to be at least into the middle of next year.
Mm-hmm. And that was the first, is that my understanding? Was it one of the first major cities?
I think so, yeah. We were first a little unsure about whether we're able even to support independent venues, particularly under Washington law, where we're not allowed to spend public money on private enterprise. There's something called prohibition on the lending of credit. But under the circumstances, the emergency circumstances, the public health circumstances, we were able to push that money out. And because it's federal funds, has fewer strings. But we're really focused on getting the Washington State Legislature to help us provide the big boost that we need. And Congress, if they can ever get around to passing legislation, the big boost we need to give the community the assurance that everybody is going to be able to get through this and come out the other side. And of course, like everywhere, we're already losing venues that just have not been able to make it through this year.
Did you have some sort of portal or structure set up for that, or was that something you had to invent on the spot?
I mean, she's right here.
I know.
Kate Becker is someone who has remarkable networks, and while for a lot of the areas that I prioritize, we have entire departments and bureaucracies. For music and film and arts, we have this dynamo who's able to cut through all the stuff and cut across not just our government, but other governments and nonprofits and businesses, and figure out how to move the pieces in order to accomplish the goals. And I have to say that, you know, in an ideal world, we would have adequate funding to be able to have an entire department or office dedicated to this. But we make do, and what we have been able to do is bring on board the best person to be able to align all the resources that do exist in order for us to be able to accomplish my goals.
Great. And I think that leads me to something that I think about a lot. Obviously, this group does in terms of a national ecosystem. Each city has its own assets and resources and histories, whether it's government structure, funding structures, people on the ground. And I'm curious if you have peers that you're working with in other cities specifically on this, and also do you have thoughts about how we translate between cities? Or, obviously there's Kate. We're learning that there's Kates in many cities, and that's how things get done. But just curious, because it's always interesting to me, and I think it's obviously part of what's happening with Revs in this group, is translating and scaling out, actually building a larger ecosystem.
Yeah, lessons are transferable, but it's clearly not a one-size-fits-all situation. We have unique circumstances here in Seattle and King County and Central Puget Sound. Some of them, as I alluded to earlier, are related to the economic condition and sort of overheated economy that's pushing people out, artists, venues, and don't just mean musical artists too, I mean visual artists and other performers out. And what we need to do here to compensate for those economic conditions, the real estate market, in order to heal in and make permanent an arts and cultural scene that benefits everyone here. Other cities have different challenges, to be sure, but there are some common issues, particularly during COVID, that where we can share information, and Kate's pretty good about gently doing this. Also, goad one another into doing better. I heard about the work that was done in Portland and in Oregon with the Association of Venues. I'm sorry, I don't remember what it's called, like figuring out how to really motivate the state government to make a major investment in helping venues get through. And we're a couple steps behind that here, but it's a good model. And it also sets the bar for us. Like, we're not going to let Portland do that to us. We're going to get in there and figure out how to do right by our venues as well. And that is true about scenes or cities, metropolitan regions all over the country. Everybody's taking a little bit different approach, but we can both draw lessons and also use that to motivate ourselves to set the bar higher.
Yeah. Well, I think to your credit and to Kate's credit, I think that I was on the call and Kate sharing her alarm and sort of what was happening in March in Seattle was very inspiring to getting a lot of us moving here in Oregon. So we all kind of work off each other. I want to make sure and circle back before we run out of time on the economics issue and what happens in Seattle. But one of the couple of things that I feel like I could keep you here all day, but I won't. I'm thinking, like, one of the things that we hear a lot is I'm curious about pushback. In terms of how do you prove value to people in government and when you're working these initiatives, and hoping that as other cities try things and they're getting pushback, that there's potentially strategies to share on that, and how we don't just stay stuck in this sort of using music as an arts economy, and that's the only kind of value we have, or is that really the point that you work from?
It's interesting because we have had really good studies of the economic value of the arts, including very much popular music in our community. And those studies have shown enormous economic returns and huge numbers of jobs being created. And that is all very influential, but I try not to lead with that, because I think that even though that's important, it might not be the single most important thing. The single most important thing is something else that each of us on this call feel in our gut, but that you can't be sure that others share, which is that arts, heritage, culture, music for me in particular, although my father's a visual artist, music for me in particular is something that defines my life and makes my life worthwhile. And it is not a luxury or a nice to have. It is part of who I am, and we cannot allow it to disappear. And what I would have expected would be that would be a privileged perspective that would not be shared by most. But I have not really gotten a lot of pushback about this notion that arts and heritage and culture and music improve the vibrancy of our lives and our neighborhoods. And you see from the corporations too, that they're not just talking about how much money goes through the till at the club. They're talking about this as part of our regional personality, the thing that makes us a place where they can get people to move, to work in their businesses. And it really, and I'll stop with this because I'm just gonna waste all of our time, but it's how we tell the story of who we are and have a conversation about either competing or maybe parallel ideas in our community that help us advance a shared agenda for ourselves and our kids. And that is something that it turns out a lot more people here are hip to than I would have guessed.
That's great to hear. I think we have this sort of really binary, antagonistic narrative that is often not authentic. And it's nice to hear that's something that you're experiencing. One of the things that we're seeing now is a broader understanding of what being an engaged and active citizen does or might look like, right? And that level of engagement is necessary to build and protect places where musicians and music and arts are embedded and thrive. Like, we can't just elect a Dow or someone else and set it and forget it. So I'm curious, what are points of engagement between government and public that we can foster, specifically as musicians? And I'm curious if I notice as a musician and independent artist and freelance, a lot of times organizations are who are brokering communication with government. And obviously there needs to be coalitions. That's important for advocacy and getting things actually effectively done. But I'm curious, from your perspective, is it like, what sort of shape is helpful to show up, and what sort of form should musicians take that's useful? Because I think I'm super excited always to hear people interested in helping musicians and venues in our ecosystem. But I also feel like sometimes we could help with other initiatives, and I'm curious what shape that would look like.
It's interesting because yesterday we had our office, our executive branch employee giving event for the year, and a musician that Kate and I know and admire named Cameron Lavi Jones was there to to share with our county employees online his art. He also happened to appear at my campaign event earlier this week. And I met him when he and I were up front at a pro-impeachment rally at night in downtown Seattle, which was a pretty funny contrast because I got up and was like the stiff politician, and then he got up all guitar and hair and just tore it up. And then we bonded over that. And so I think that having musicians participate in, for musicians to participate in the real current issues that are going on, yes, in protests, but also in the more mundane work of building community and advancing policy, is enormously helpful. I mean, when I was getting into this, again, a lot of musicians were involved just in sort of music policy and then helping on my campaign and eventually on other people's campaigns. But having the community band together and figure out what people want to see this place become, and participating, whether it's in, advocating on mobility or anti-racism or legal system reform or environmental restoration, which is actually how I met Cameron's mother, or any of the rest of these issues is enormously valuable. Creating the ties that bind us together as a community with music as a very important part of the core of that relationship has proved to me to be very helpful.
I like hearing that. And in terms of that, also some of the thing you mentioned earlier on, the concern about the economics of Seattle not being supportive and not nourishing music and creative class, especially independent. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
It's just really rough. I've been talking about this for like 20 years, but all of this creativity was fostered because there were garages and basements and affordable places where musicians, not just by themselves, but like collectively, could be and work, and it's true of visual artists as well. And as the price of everything has gone up and gentrification has happened and garages suddenly became, $700,000 carriage houses, people have been pushed out. And that is not just about the inconvenience of moving to some town 20 miles away. It's about not being able to be there face-to-face interacting with your peers, with the other creatives who are helping you develop your ideas and challenging you and performing with you. And the venues themselves, whether they're art galleries or clubs, those are anchors in neighborhoods that give them their personality, like the Chipotle and the 7-Eleven up the street can't. And we have to aggressively go in and make permanent space for those. Now, I want to give credit to the city of Seattle and its mayor for starting down that road now and trying to figure out how they can really artificially affect the real estate market, intervene to preserve these last best places in our neighborhoods. But we have to do a lot more, and it's not just Seattle. We have 39 cities and 3 counties in this metropolitan region that have a great musical heritage, and it's going to be greatly diminished if we don't intervene financially.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughts on that effort. It is a big lift. We just have 1 or 2 more minutes, but I wanted to ask you a big question, which is with this in the year of disruption, in this 2020 moment, and there's what artists are being asked to show up with our imagination, with our wild imagination. And I joke that, things are really bad when people are coming to artists and saying, what can you guys help us with? But I do think, and it was touched on the previous panel, there's so much potential. We're all very overwhelmed, whether it's mental health or lots of extra work, or, we're not working at full capacity. But it is this beautiful moment of radical imagination that actually is possible. And I'm curious if there's something, even what you just spoke about in terms of is there a coalition that we can actually do some intervention on gentrification and on who owns capital in cities and who owns properties. Are there a couple thoughts that you have? Is there some like dream moment, like moonshot launch that you want to share before we close?
Well, there's like three things, and I know we got to close, but first off, we gathered, I think, about 150 or so musicians and music industry people together in King County Music Initiative launch in February, right before COVID, again at Washington Hall. And it was very exciting because a lot of people who are worried about the same things I'm talking about, being in a room together and feeling like they had support and fellow travelers, that could begin to be creative about how we take that on. And I'm excited to continue that work, which will be a lot easier to continue when we're able to be in one place together again. I do think that there's a moment right now with these sort of multiple overlapping compounding crises for us to take our communities and our nation in a different direction. And there's never been a social movement that succeeded without music at its core, right? And I'm not too much pressure here, but that is the history of every successful social and political movement here and abroad. It has music that drives it forward. And so we need to align around what America we want. And after this presidential election, we recognize that there is an enormous amount at stake. And we should put musicians front and center, both as policymakers and as the leaders of the parade in driving forward the kind of change that is going to allow our nation to deliver on its potential. Thank you, Rebecca, so much. I'm honored and humbled that you would deign to interview me, and I'm excited to see where we can take this from here.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. Really appreciate your dedication to music and to arts. It's heartening and encouraging, and we'll figure it out there.
We're not alone.
Nope. Thank you so much. Back to you, Bracy.